I'm here today in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick, Maryland, and it is the burial place of several people with interesting or historical stories to be told, and so let's take a look at some of those stories. Behind me is the final resting place of Francis Scott Key and his wife Mary. Francis Scott Key, known to many Americans as the author of what is now our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, a song that he wrote from aboard a ship in the harbor while observing the bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore during the War of 1812. I learned a few things even yet this morning studying up about this, and I had always assumed that Francis Scott Key, as a lawyer, not really a songwriter, had just written a poem and it was later put to music, but he actually wrote it as a song with the music, and it was published the next day. So it wasn't like there was a long time between when he wrote it and when it became famous. It instantly became an anthem that people loved and cherished because they were in the middle of a war. Francis Scott Key was from here in Frederick, Maryland. When he originally died, I believe in 1844, he was actually buried in another cemetery called Old St. Paul's Cemetery, and he was later moved here. And I think 20 years after he died, he was buried here in this cemetery, and then he was moved yet again in 1898 when he was placed in a vault below this monument that you see behind me, along with his wife. And there are a lot of great historical markers here. You can see some of those behind me where they tell a lot of the story of the people buried here and their connections to history. So if you come here, you don't really need to know where they are. Everything's clearly marked in the cemetery and lets you know where to go and who the people were. So Francis Scott Key. Well, I'm here on the far end of the cemetery here in Frederick, and behind me you see a monument that is dedicated to the hundreds of Confederate soldiers who are buried here along a fence line that I'll tour here in just a minute. Most of them come from the nearby battles of Antietam and Monocacy, and some are from other battles as well. But the original plan had been to bury the Confederate soldiers on the Antietam battlefield in the National Cemetery. You have to remember, Maryland was a border state, it was a slave state, and it was fairly evenly divided between North and South in its loyalties, and there were thousands of men who volunteered for both sides, and so it was one of those places where they felt they would bury them together. That ended up not happening, and they moved most of the Confederate dead from Antietam, for example, to here in Frederick or nearby Hagerstown. Also in a town in West Virginia, I believe some of them were buried. So this is the Confederate Monument. These are just some of the hundreds of dead that are buried here from the Confederate Army along the fence line. You can see the original markers in front, and then newer government-issued markers in the rear. And these appear mostly to have been men who died around the time of the Battle of Monocacy in 1864. And they're all in order. By when they died, you can tell that they were buried as they died, because the dates are chronological. But amazingly, most of them have names. Perhaps the unknown are buried in another section or in another cemetery. Well, here in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick, we also find the grave of Barbara Fritchie. Lesser known story from the Civil War, but definitely one that has become romanticized over the years. It was said that 95-year-old Barbara Fritchie, when Stonewall Jackson and his Confederate troops came through the town of Frederick during the Antietam campaign, that this 95-year-old woman defiantly waved a Union flag out the window of her house. And it became such a well-known story that a poem was written about it, a poem that became famous, talking about her interaction with Stonewall Jackson that day. And it was famous enough that when Winston Churchill visited this cemetery about 100 years after the event took place, he quoted this poem from memory, those lines about Barbara Fritchie. And here she's buried today.